The needle slipped, pricking Clara's finger for the third time that morning. She didn't flinch, just wiped the blood on her already stained apron and kept stitching Mrs. Helmsworth's ridiculous curtains, yards and yards of fabric that cost more than Clara would see in 6 months, for windows in a house with more rooms than the woman had thoughts in her head. "You're bleeding on my drapes," Mrs. Helmsworth said without looking up from her tea. "No, ma'am, I wiped it." "Well, be more careful. I won't pay for blood-stained goods." Clara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Never did. 26 years old, and she'd learned that lesson better than any other. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and maybe you'll eat tomorrow. The parlor smelled like rosewater and money, two things Clara had never had and never would. Through the window, she could see the main street of Stillwater, Montana territory. March 1884, and the town was the same as it had been since she'd arrived as a scrawny 8-year-old clinging to Aunt Ingrid's hand. Cold, gray, unforgiving. "I heard your aunt's taken a turn," Mrs. Helmsworth said, voice dripping with the kind of sympathy that wasn't sympathy at all. "Such a shame. What will you do when she passes?" There it was. The question everyone had been asking, in one form or another, for the past 2 weeks. What will you do, Clara? Where will you go? As if her aunt dying was an inconvenience to them, a disruption in the natural order of who they could call on for desperate cheap labor. "I'll manage," Clara said quietly. "Will you?" Mrs. Helmsworth finally looked at her, eyes sharp and calculating. "A woman alone, no family, no prospects. The boarding house won't let you stay without payment. And I can't imagine who'd hire you for anything beyond mending, dear. You're not exactly—" She waved her hand vaguely. "Well, you understand." Clara understood perfectly. She wasn't pretty enough to catch a husband, wasn't charming enough to work in the nicer establishments, wasn't strong enough for the harder labor. She was nothing and nobody, and in 3 days, maybe 4 if Aunt Ingrid's stubborn heart kept beating, she'd be nothing and nobody with nowhere to sleep. "I should finish these," Clara said, bending back over the curtains. Mrs. Helmsworth sniffed. "Yes." "Do what?" The walk back to the boarding house took 15 minutes, cutting through the alleys because the main street meant passing the Mercantile where Thomas Graves worked, and she couldn't stomach another encounter with him and his wet dog laugh. He'd proposed to her once 3 years ago, drunk and mean-spirited, as a joke in front of half the town. When she'd said no, quietly, with what little dignity she could scrape together, he'd made it his personal mission to remind everyone within earshot that she'd turned down her only chance. The boarding house sat at the edge of town, a sagging 2-story structure that smelled like boiled cabbage and misery. Mrs. Chen, who ran the place with an iron fist and surprisingly little judgment, nodded as Clara came through the kitchen. "She's awake," Mrs. Chen said, "asking for you." Clara took the stairs 2 at a time, the floorboards creaking under her worn boots. The room she shared with Aunt Ingrid was barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a washstand, but it had been home for 18 years. The only home she remembered. Ingrid Hayes lay propped against pillows that had gone flat years ago, her face the color of old parchment. She'd been beautiful once, Clara had seen the daguerreotype, but illness and hardship had whittled her down to something sharp and brittle. "You're late," Ingrid rasped. "Mrs. Helmsworth kept me." Clara poured water from the pitcher, held the cup to her aunt's lips. "Drink." Ingrid managed 2 sips before pushing it away. "That woman's a vulture." "She pays." "Barely." Ingrid's breath rattled in her chest, a sound Clara had grown to hate. "Come here. Sit." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, taking her aunt's hand. The bones felt like bird wings under the papery skin. "I'm dying," Ingrid said flatly. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. 2 days, maybe 3. We both know it." Her grip tightened with surprising strength. "And we both know what happens to you when I'm gone." Clara's throat closed up. She'd spent 2 weeks trying not to think about it, about the very real possibility of ending up on the street, or worse. Women alone didn't fare well out here. She'd seen what happened to them. "I have some money saved," Clara managed. "Enough for a week. Maybe 2. Ingrid's eyes, still sharp despite everything, bore into her. Then what? You think any decent man in this town would marry you? You think any of these people would help? The truth sat heavy between them. No, they wouldn't. There might be work in Helena, Clara said, hating how weak her voice sounded. Or Butte. You could die trying to get there with winter barely over. Ingrid pulled her hand free, pressed it against her chest. Listen to me. When I'm gone, you take what little I have. The money in the tin under my bed, the silver locket, it was your mother's. Should have given it to you years ago. You sell what you can, you take what you must, and you get out of this town. Where would I go? Anywhere but here, Ingrid's voice cracked. I brought you to this place thinking it would be better than where we came from. I was wrong. These people, they've decided who you are, Clara, and they'll never let you be anything else. Clara felt the tears coming and bit them back. She'd learned young that crying accomplished nothing. Promise me, Ingrid whispered. Promise me you'll fight for something better than this. I promise. Ingrid nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep. Clara sat there until the light faded, watching the woman who'd raised her slip away inch by inch, and tried to imagine a future that didn't end with her face down in a ditch, or working herself to death in some mining town brothel. She couldn't. Ingrid died on a Tuesday morning, quietly and without fuss, the way she'd lived most of her life. Clara found her just after dawn, already cold, her face finally peaceful. For a long moment, Clara just stood there, numb, wondering if she was supposed to feel more than this hollow ache. She'd known it was coming, had prepared herself. But standing there alone in that dingy room with her last connection to anything like family gone forever, that hit different than she'd expected. Mrs. Chen helped with the arrangements. The funeral was small, barely a dozen people, most of them there out of morbid curiosity rather than respect. Reverend Michaels said words that meant nothing about a woman he'd never bothered to know. They buried Ingrid in the town cemetery on a plot so cheap it would probably wash away come spring thaw. Clara stood at the graveside in her only black dress, threadbare at the elbows, hem let down twice, and felt the eyes on her, calculating, measuring, wondering what she'd do now. She wondered the same thing. That night, alone in the room that was now just hers, until Mrs. Chen inevitably rented it to someone who could actually pay, Clara counted her aunt's money. $14.30. The locket would maybe bring another $5 if she could find someone willing to buy it. Call it $20 total. 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if she stretched it and ate less. Then nothing. She lay awake until the small hours, listening to the wind howl against the thin walls, and tried to pray. But she'd never been any good at it, and tonight the words wouldn't come at all. Just the cold certainty that she was going to die in this town, forgotten and unmourned, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. The man walked into Mrs. Chen's kitchen 3 days after the funeral, and Clara's first thought was that death itself had decided to stop by for breakfast. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of hard labor rather than easy living, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the weather too long. His clothes were quality but worn, the kind of worn that came from use rather than poverty. He moved like someone who'd spent more time in the wilderness than in towns, careful and deliberate, eyes constantly scanning. But it was his color that caught Clara's attention, or rather, the lack of it. His skin had a grayish tinge beneath the weathered tan, and his eyes, dark as river stones, sat too deep in his skull. He looked like a man who'd already started the slow slide into the grave, but hadn't had the courtesy to lie down yet. "Help you?" Mrs. Chen asked, spatula in hand. "Looking for Clara Hayes," the man said. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Heard she rooms here." Every eye in the kitchen swiveled to Clara, who'd frozen with a plate of half-eaten eggs in front of her. "That's me?" she managed. The man looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Need to speak with you. Private." Mrs. Chen bristled. "This is a respectable house. I'm aware." He pulled out a silver dollar, set it on the table. "For your trouble and her time." A silver dollar for a conversation. Clara's pulse kicked up. That was more than she'd make in a week of sewing, Either this man was dangerously stupid with money, or whatever he wanted to talk about was serious enough to pay for privacy. Mrs. Chen snatched up the coin, tested it with her teeth, and jerked her head toward the parlor. 15 minutes. Door stays open. Clara followed the stranger into the small, cluttered room, acutely aware that everyone in the kitchen was straining to hear. He moved to the window, looked out at the muddy street, then turned to face her. "My name's Rowan Pike," he said. Clara blinked. Everyone in Montana Territory knew that name. Rowan Pike, the legendary mountain man, the trapper who'd spent 30 years in the wildest parts of the Rockies, who knew the mountains better than any living soul, who'd survived things that would have killed lesser men a dozen times over. Stories about Rowan Pike got traded in saloons and around campfires. Half of them probably bullshit, but even the half that wasn't made him something more legend than man, and he looked exactly like someone who'd lived that hard for that long. "I know who you are," Clara said quietly. "Then you know I don't waste time." He studied her with those unsettling dark eyes. "I'm dying. Got maybe 6 months, probably less. Lung fever that won't shake, and the doc says it's in my blood now. Nothing to be done." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I got land up in the mountains," Pike continued. "Good land. A cabin, trap lines, everything a person would need to make a life. Been building it for 20 years. But I got no family, no heirs. When I die, the territory's going to auction it off, and some bastard who never set foot in those mountains is going to get everything I worked for." He paused, and Clara saw something flicker across his face. Not quite pain, but close. "I don't want that," he said. "So I'm looking for a wife." The words hung in the air between them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Why me?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Pike's expression didn't change. "Because you got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Because you're young enough to survive what I need you to do, but old enough that you won't have romantic notions about it. Because this town's going to chew you up and spit you out, and we both know it." He wasn't wrong. About any of it. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Clara asked carefully. "Marry me. Come up to the mountain. Live there for 1 year." His voice was flat, businesslike. "In that year, you give me a child, an heir, someone to leave it all to." Clara's breath caught. "A child? A son, preferably, but I'll take what comes." Pike shifted his weight, and Clara caught the slight wince he tried to hide. Dying, she thought, really dying. "After the year, everything I own becomes yours. The land, the cabin, the trap lines, everything. Legally yours. You can stay, you can sell it, you can do whatever the hell you want with it. But you'll have it. And if I don't get pregnant? Then you stay the full year anyway, and it's still yours." He crossed his arms. "But I'll be honest with you, I'm betting on the child. That's the point of this whole thing. Legacy." Clara's mind raced. A year. 1 year of her life in exchange for land, security, a future. With a dying man in the middle of nowhere, expected to bear his child. It was insane. It was also the only real offer she'd had in her entire life. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I could be, I don't know, crazy. A thief. Could be." Pike shrugged. "But I've asked around. You're a hard worker. You don't complain. You keep your head down. That's all I need. I'm not looking for love or companionship. I'm looking for someone who can survive, who can give me what I need, and who's smart enough to know a good deal when she hears one." "This isn't a good deal," Clara said. "This is a desperate deal." For the first time, something like approval flickered in Pike's eyes. "Maybe, but desperate deals are the only kind that matter. Everything else is just people pretending they got choices they don't have." He pulled out a piece of paper from his coat, unfolded it. "This is a contract. Says you marry me, stay 1 year, make a good faith effort to conceive. In exchange, you get everything. If I die before the year's up, which I probably will, it's all yours anyway, no conditions. If you leave before the year's up, you get nothing. If you stay but can't conceive, you still get everything." Clara took the paper with shaking hands. The words swam before her eyes, but the gist was clear. 1 year, everything. "I need an answer by tomorrow," Pike said. "After that, I'm asking someone else. I don't have time to wait around." He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Where we're going, it's hard. Harder than anything you've done here. The mountains don't give a damn about your feelings or your comfort. They'll kill you if you're not strong enough. So think about that before you say yes. Think real hard about whether you can handle it. He left without waiting for a response. Clara stood there for a long moment, the contract crumpling in her grip, her whole body shaking with something that might have been fear, or might have been the first real hope she'd felt in years. She didn't sleep that night, just paced the small room, reading and rereading the contract by candlelight until she'd memorized every word. It was simple, brutally so. No flowery language, no loopholes she could see, just a straightforward exchange, her time and her body for his legacy and her future. The smart thing would be to say no, to recognize this for what it was. A gamble with odds that could easily kill her. A year in the wilderness with a dying stranger, expected to bear his child, with nothing but his word that she'd actually get what he promised. But what was the alternative? Stay in Stillwater and slowly starve? Take her $20 and try to make it to another town, where she'd be just as alone and just as desperate? Hope some miracle dropped into her lap? She'd been hoping for miracles her whole life. They never came. At dawn, Clara washed her face, put on her least worn dress, and walked to the address Pike had left with Mrs. Chen. A room above the saloon at the end of town. She found him sitting by the window, cleaning a rifle. He looked worse in the morning light, the gray tinge more pronounced, but his hands were steady on the weapon. "I'll do it," Clara said before she could lose her nerve. Pike looked up, studied her face. "You sure?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." Something that might have been respect crossed his features. He set the rifle aside, pulled out another paper. "Then we do this proper. We sign the contract, we go to the justice of the peace, we get married, then we leave." "When?" "Today. I've already got the horses and supplies. No point waiting around." "Today." Clara felt her stomach drop. "I have things. Leave them or bring them, but we're leaving before noon. I'm done with this town." Clara thought about the room at Mrs. Chen's, the few possessions she'd accumulated over the years. None of it mattered. None of it was worth keeping. "All right," she said. "Today." They signed the contract first, with Mrs. Chen and her husband as witnesses. The old woman looked at Clara with something like pity, but she didn't try to talk her out of it. Maybe she understood that some choices weren't really choices at all. The justice of the peace married them in his office, a 5-minute ceremony that meant everything and nothing. Pike's hand was warm and calloused when he slipped the simple gold band on her finger, his expression unchanged. When it was done, Clara was legally Clara Pike, wife to a dying legend, bound to a bargain she still couldn't quite believe she'd made. They stopped at the mercantile for a few last-minute supplies. Thomas Graves was there, of course, his face going red when he saw them together. "Clara Hayes marrying Rowan Pike," he said loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Now I've seen everything. Guess you'll take anyone desperate enough, huh, Clara?" Pike turned slowly, his dark eyes fixing on Graves with the kind of look that made grown men take a step back. "That's Clara Pike now, and she's worth 10 of you on your best day." He said it flat, factual, like he was commenting on the weather, but something in his tone made Graves shut his mouth and find somewhere else to be. They left Stillwater just after noon, Clara on a sturdy mare Pike had bought, Pike on a massive gelding that looked like it could carry the world. Clara didn't look back at the town, didn't want to give it the satisfaction. The mountains rose ahead of them, snow-capped and impossibly vast, and Clara felt her new husband's eyes on her. "Last chance," Pike said. "You can still turn back." Clara thought about the life she was leaving, the room that smelled like cabbage, the endless sewing, the eyes that looked through her like she was already dead. "No," she said. "I can't." Pike nodded once, then kicked his horse forward. Clara followed him into the wilderness, toward a future she couldn't imagine, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope that this insane gamble might actually save her life instead of ending it. The first 3 days of riding were hell. Clara had ridden horses before, but never for hours at a stretch, never over terrain that seemed designed specifically to break her. Pike set a brutal pace, stopping only when the horses needed rest, barely speaking except to bark directions or warnings. They climbed higher and higher into the mountains, leaving the last scattered homesteads behind, pushing into territory that looked like no human had ever touched it. Clara's whole body screamed. Her thighs were raw, her back ached, her hands blistered from gripping the reins. But she didn't complain. Wouldn't give Pike the satisfaction of proving her weak. She watched him instead, trying to understand the man she'd married. He was economical in everything: movement, words, energy. Never wasted anything. He seemed to know every inch of the trail despite the snow and mud obscuring it, navigating by instinct or memory she couldn't guess. When they stopped to rest the horses, he'd scan the surroundings with those dark eyes, cataloging threats she couldn't see. He was also clearly dying. She could hear it in the way his breath rattled when the trail got steep, see it in the way he'd grip the saddle horn when he thought she wasn't looking. But he never slowed, never showed weakness beyond what his body forced on him. On the third night, they made camp in a small clearing surrounded by pines. Pike built the fire with practiced efficiency, while Clara tended the horses, her fingers numb with cold. "You did all right today," he said, handing her a tin cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint. It was the first almost compliment he'd given her. Clara wrapped her frozen hands around the cup and tried not to show how much those 4 words meant. "How much farther?" she asked. 2 more days. Maybe 3 if the pass is still snowed in." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Tomorrow gets harder, steeper. You'll need to walk part of it, lead your horse." Clara nodded, too tired to argue. They ate in silence, jerky and hardtack that tasted like sadness, but filled the empty space in her stomach. Clara watched the fire, watched the darkness pressing in around them, and tried not to think about how alone they were, how far from anything resembling civilization. "You scared?" Pike asked suddenly. Clara considered lying, decided against it. "Yes." "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." He took a sip of coffee, grimaced. "But don't let it make you stupid. The mountains don't care about your fear. They'll kill you just as quick whether you're brave or terrified." "Comforting." Pike's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. "I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to make sure you survive long enough to give me what I need." Right. The bargain. Claire had almost forgotten, in the exhaustion and pain of the past few days, exactly what this was, what she'd agreed to. She stopped, started again. When do you want to... when will we... Not yet, Pike said, cutting her off. You need to acclimate first. Get used to the altitude, the cold, the work. I need you strong and healthy, not half dead from exhaustion. His eyes found hers across the fire. Besides, you're not ready. I can see it in how you're looking at me, like I'm gonna hurt you. Are you? Not if I can help it. He stood, tossed the rest of his coffee into the fire. Get some sleep. We leave at first light. Clara wrapped herself in the blankets Pike had provided, lay down on the hard ground, and stared up at the stars. They were brighter here than she'd ever seen, millions of them, impossibly far away and impossibly clear. She fell asleep wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, and woke to Pike shaking her shoulder, the sky barely gray with dawn. Up, he said. We got ground to cover. Us. They reached Pike's land on the 5th day, in late afternoon, when the light was going gold and the shadows stretched long across the valley. Clara had been expecting a shack, maybe, or a lean-to. Something rough and temporary. What she got instead stopped her breath. The valley was small, tucked between 3 peaks like a secret, with a creek running through the center that caught the light and threw it back in silver sparks. Pines covered the slopes, thick and dark green, and the meadow grass, just starting to green up with spring, rippled in the wind. And in the center of it all, set back against the tree line, stood a cabin. It was solid, well built, with a stone chimney and glass windows that must have cost a fortune to get up here. Not huge, but not small either. Big enough for a family. Pike had built this for more than just himself. This is it, Pike said, and Clara heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Pride, maybe? Or love. They rode down into the valley, and Clara saw more as they got closer. A barn, small but sturdy. A smokehouse. A root cellar built into the hillside. Stacks of firewood under tarps. Everything a person would need to survive. Built with care and precision. This wasn't a homestead. This was a legacy. Pike dismounted, and Clara followed suit, her legs nearly giving out after 5 days of riding. The horses were tired too, heads hanging, but Pike led them to the barn first, got them settled and fed before anything else. "Always take care of the animals first," he said. "They keep you alive out here. You remember that." Clara nodded, watching him move through the barn with the ease of long familiarity. This was his place, his world, and she was the intruder. When the horses were settled, Pike led her to the cabin. The door wasn't locked. Who was there to steal from out here? And it swung open on leather hinges that didn't squeak. Inside was warmer than she'd expected. Pike went straight to the fireplace, built a fire with the wood that had been left stacked beside it. As the light grew, Clara looked around. One main room with a cook stove in the corner, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies and equipment, a bed in the far corner, big enough for 2, covered with furs and blankets. A smaller room off to the side that Pike used for storage. It was simple, almost Spartan, but it was clean and well maintained. The work of a man who took care of what was his. "This is home now," Pike said, turning from the fire. "At least for the next year." Clara set down the small bag that held everything she'd brought from town. "It's more than I expected. I don't live like an animal, even if I work like one." He moved to the shelves, started pulling down supplies. "We'll eat, then I'll show you around before it gets dark. You need to know where everything is, how everything works. Can't have you helpless up here." They ate stew Pike made from dried meat and vegetables he'd stored, and it was better than anything Clara had eaten in months. As they ate, Pike laid out the rules. "You pull your weight. I'm not keeping you as decoration. There's work here, constant work, and you'll do your share." He held up a hand as Clara started to speak. "I'll teach you what you don't know, but you learn fast or you make us both miserable. Understood?" "Understood." "You don't go wandering off alone until you know the land. It's easy to get lost, easy to get hurt, and I can't be watching you every second." Clara nodded. "And when it's time, when I say it's time, you don't fight me on it. That's the bargain. That's what you agreed to." Clara's stomach twisted, but she met his eyes. "I won't fight you." Pike studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. Finish eating. We got work to do." The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Clara's life. Pike worked her like a pack mule, teaching her everything she'd need to know to survive. How to split wood without taking her own foot off. How to haul water from the creek. How to check the trap lines he'd set before winter. How to read the weather, read the forest, read the signs that meant danger. Clara had thought herself strong, but this was different. This was relentless. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her arms ached constantly. She fell into bed each night so exhausted she couldn't even think, and woke to Pike shaking her shoulder before dawn, ready to do it all again. But she learned, fast, like he'd demanded, and slowly, grudgingly, she felt herself changing. The softness that had come from town living burned away. Her body hardened, adapted. Her mind sharpened. She stopped flinching at every noise in the forest, stopped jumping when Pike spoke. Started moving with purpose instead of hesitation. Pike noticed. She could see it in the way he watched her, the small nods when she did something right, the corrections that came less frequently. They barely spoke beyond what was necessary. Pike wasn't a talker, and Clara had learned young that silence was safer than words. But in the quiet, she started to understand him, or at least the shape of him. He was dying, but he refused to act like it. Worked himself just as hard as he worked her, despite the cough that got worse every night, despite the pain she could see flickering across his face when he thought she wasn't looking. He was building something, had been building it for years, and he'd be damned if he stopped now. And he was kind, in his way. Gruff and blunt, but never cruel. When Clara burned dinner, twice, he just ate it without comment and showed her how to do it better the next time. When she nearly twisted her ankle on the trail, he caught her without a word and made her sit until the swelling went down. He pushed her hard, but never beyond what she could actually handle. It wasn't affection, but it wasn't hatred either. It was something like respect, earned inch by painful inch. 3 weeks after they'd arrived, Pike came to her while she was mending one of his shirts by the fire. "You've done well," he said without preamble. "Better than I expected." Clara looked up, needle paused mid-stitch. Pike stood across the room, backlit by the lamp, and she saw the tension in his shoulders. "Thank you," she said carefully. "I think it's time," he continued, his voice flat. "You're strong enough now, healthy enough, and I'm running out of time to wait." Clara's pulse kicked up. She'd known this was coming, had agreed to it, but knowing and facing it were two different things. She set down the mending, stood up. Her hands were shaking, and she hated herself for it. Pike crossed the room, stopped a few feet away. Up close, she could see the toll the work had taken on him. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and the gray tinge to his skin had deepened. "I won't hurt you," he said quietly. "I'll try to make it as easy as I can. But this is the bargain, Clara. This is what we agreed to." "I know." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm ready." She wasn't, but that didn't matter. Pike reached out, took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the cold night. "Then come to bed." He led her to the big bed in the corner, and Clara tried to quiet the panic rising in her chest. This was practical, she told herself. Transactional. Just part of the deal, like learning to split wood or check trap lines. But when Pike began unbuttoning her dress, his movements careful and deliberate, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Not from fear, though there was that, but from the sheer strangeness of it all. She'd expected to die alone and unmourned in Stillwater. Instead, she was here, in the middle of the wilderness, giving herself to a dying stranger in exchange for a future she still couldn't quite believe was real. "Breathe," Pike said, his hands stilling. "Just breathe," Clara did, forcing air into her lungs, and Pike waited until her breathing evened before continuing. It hurt less than she'd feared. Pike was true to his word, careful, methodical, trying to make it bearable. But it was still awkward and uncomfortable and deeply weird. Two strangers performing an act that should have meant something but instead felt clinical. When it was over, Pike rolled away, his breathing harsh. Clara lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ache between her legs and wondering if it had worked, if one time was enough. It wasn't, of course. Over the next few weeks, Pike came to her regularly, always at night, always with the same quiet efficiency. It never got easier exactly, but Clara stopped dreading it quite so much, started to see it for what it was, a means to an end for both of them. And slowly, impossibly, something shifted between them. It started small. A shared glance over morning coffee that lasted half a second longer than necessary. Pike's hand on her elbow when the trail got icy, steadying her without a word. The way Clara stopped flinching when he came near, started leaning into his space instead of away from it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing Pike would have written poems about, not that he was the type. Just two people learning to exist in the same space without the sharp edges cutting quite so deep. 6 weeks into their arrangement, Clara woke before dawn to find Pike already up, standing at the window with his rifle. The pre-dawn light made his face look carved from stone. "What is it?" she whispered. "Grizzly. Been watching the cabin for the past hour." Clara's blood went cold. She'd seen the claw marks on trees during their supply runs, heard Pike's warnings about staying alert, but hearing about danger and facing it were two entirely different things. "What do we do?" "We wait." Pike didn't take his eyes off the window. "He's just curious. Probably smelled the smoke, wanted to investigate. Long as we don't spook him or give him reason to think there's food here, he'll move on." They stood there in the growing light, Clara barely breathing, until the massive shadow outside finally lumbered away into the trees. Pike relaxed fractionally, set the rifle down. "That's the reality of this place," he said. "We're not at the top of the food chain. You remember that." Clara nodded, her heart still hammering. "Have you ever had to shoot one?" "Twice. Both times because they got into my food stores and decided they owned the place." Pike moved to the stove, started building up the fire. "Killing a grizzly's a last resort. They're tough as hell, mean when cornered, and even if you drop one, you've just announced to every predator in 20 miles that there's fresh meat available." He said it matter-of-factly, the way some men talked about the weather. Clara watched him work. Watched the economical way he moved despite the cough that rattled in his chest every few minutes, and felt something shift in her understanding of him. This wasn't just survival for Pike. This was his whole world, hard-won and fiercely protected, and he was trying to give it to her, to teach her everything he knew before his time ran out. "Show me," Clara said suddenly. Pike glanced back at her. "Show you what?" How to shoot. Really shoot, not just point and hope. She crossed her arms. If something happens to you before the year's up, I need to be able to protect myself. You said I need to pull my weight. Well, I can't do that if I'm helpless with a gun. Pike studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. After breakfast, we start. The shooting lessons became a daily ritual. Pike set up targets behind the cabin, logs with crude circles carved into them, and made Clara practice until her shoulders ached and her ears rang despite the cloth he'd given her to muffle the sound. She was terrible at first, couldn't hit anything, kept jerking the trigger, flinched every time the rifle kicked against her shoulder. Stop thinking, Pike said after she'd missed the target for the 20th time. Your head's getting in the way. Feel it instead. The weight, the balance. Breathe out slow, squeeze gentle. Like you're trying not to wake someone up. Clara tried again, missed again. Here, Pike moved behind her, his chest against her back, his arms coming around to adjust her grip. Relax your shoulders. You're wound up tighter than a spring. His breath was warm against her ear, and Clara felt her face heat despite the cold morning air. This close, she could smell him, wood smoke and leather, and something earthier, something that made her stomach do a strange flip. Now, Pike murmured, breathe out and squeeze. Clara did. The rifle cracked, and the log 20 yards away shattered right where she'd been aiming. There, Pike said, satisfaction in his voice. See? You can do it when you stop overthinking. He stepped back, and Clara immediately missed the warmth of him. The thought startled her enough that she nearly dropped the rifle. Over the next few weeks, her aim improved. Not perfect, she'd never be the marksman Pike was, but good enough to hit what she was aiming at more often than not. Good enough to maybe survive if she had to. And through it all, that strange new awareness grew between them. The accidental brush of hands when passing tools. The way Pike's gaze would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The nights when their transactional arrangement started feeling like something else entirely, something neither of them had names for. Clara tried not to think about it. This was a business deal, nothing more. In less than a year, she'd be free, wealthy by her standards, able to make her own choices. Getting attached to a dying man was the stupidest thing she could possibly do, but her heart didn't seem to care much about logic. One evening, 2 months into their marriage, Pike came back from checking the trap lines with blood soaking through his shirt. Clara was skinning a rabbit, something she'd gotten surprisingly good at, when she heard his horse. She looked up, saw him swaying in the saddle, and dropped the knife. What happened? Cougar took exception to me messing with her kill. Pike dismounted, winced, got her claws into me before I convinced her to leave. Clara rushed over, pulled his coat back. 3 long gashes ran from his shoulder to his ribs, deep enough that she could see meat. Blood pulsed out with each heartbeat. Get inside, she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Now. She'd learned basic wound care from Aunt Ingrid, who'd patched up more than her share of injuries from the men in Stillwater who were too drunk or too stupid to see a real doctor. But those had been bar fights and accidents, not cougar attacks. Inside, Clara made Pike sit while she heated water, found the whiskey he kept for emergencies, dug out the needle and thread he'd shown her weeks ago. Her hands shook as she cut away his ruined shirt. It's not as bad as it looks, Pike said, but his face had gone gray. Shut up and drink this. Clara handed him the whiskey bottle. Pike took a long pull, then another. You done this before? Once. Sewed up a man who got kicked by a horse. Clara poured whiskey over the wounds, and Pike hissed through his teeth. He lived, if that makes you feel better. Did he keep all his parts? Most of them, Pike laughed, then regretted it as the movement pulled at his torn flesh. Well, that's comforting. Clara worked as quickly as she could, cleaning the wounds, stitching them closed with thread she hoped was clean enough. Pike drank steadily from the bottle, his breathing harsh but controlled. When she finally tied off the last stitch, her hands were covered in his blood and shaking so hard she could barely hold the needle. Done, she managed. Pike looked down at her work, nodded. Not bad, neat stitches. Don't move for at least a week. And if you see red streaks spreading from the wounds, you tell me immediately. That's infection, and if we don't catch it early... She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. They both knew what infection meant this far from any real doctor. Pike reached out, caught her wrist with his good hand. His grip was warm, steady, despite the whiskey. "Thank you." Clara looked at his hand on hers, at the blood under her fingernails, and felt something crack open in her chest. "You can't die yet," she said, and hated how her voice broke. "We have a bargain." "I know." Pike's thumb traced circles on her wrist, probably unconscious. "I'm not planning on it." But they both knew plans didn't mean much when you were already dying. The wounds healed cleaner than Clara had dared hope, though Pike carried the scars afterward, 3 pale lines across his chest that she traced sometimes in the dark, learning the geography of him one mark at a time. And something changed after that night. The walls they'd both built started coming down, brick by careful brick. Pike began talking more. Not chatty, never that, but he'd tell her stories while they worked. About the early days in the mountains, when he'd been young and stupid and convinced he was invincible. About the trappers he'd known, most of them dead now from age or violence or simple bad luck. About the land itself, the way it changed with the seasons, the hidden places only he knew. Clara told her own stories in return. About Aunt Ingrid, who'd been harder than stone on the outside, but had cried every night for the first year after Clara's parents died. About the endless gray monotony of Stillwater, where nothing ever changed except who was drinking themselves to death fastest. About the small rebellions she'd staged, sewing ugly flowers into Mrs. Helmsworth's curtains where the woman would never see them, deliberately burning Thomas Graves' order that one time, stealing an apple from the mercantile just because she could. Pike laughed at that last one, a real laugh that turned into a coughing fit. "You're tougher than you look." "Had to be. Stillwater would have eaten me alive otherwise." "This place will try the same thing," Pike said. "But I think you might just be mean enough to survive it." Mean enough. Clara decided to take it as a compliment. Spring crept into summer and the valley transformed. The meadow grass grew waist-high, thick and green. Wildflowers exploded in riots of color, purple lupine, yellow balsam root, red paintbrush. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the mountains themselves seemed to soften, the harsh winter edges giving way to something almost gentle. Pike took Clara higher into the mountains, showing her the trap lines, the best hunting spots, the secret meadows where elk gathered. He was teaching her the land, making sure she'd know it well enough to survive when he was gone. And Clara learned with a fierce desperation she hadn't felt since childhood, learned to read tracks in the mud, to tell fresh scat from old, to move through the forest without snapping every branch. Learned which plants were food and which were poison, where to find water in a drought, how to start a fire in the rain. She still made mistakes, plenty of them. Tripped over roots, spooked game, cut herself on her own knife more times than she could count. But she learned from each one, adapted, got better. Pike watched her transformation with something that looked like pride, though he'd never say it outright. Just small nods, grunts of approval, the occasional, "You're getting there." 3 months in, Clara realized her monthly bleeding hadn't come. She waited another week, hoping she was wrong, but knowing in her gut she wasn't. She told Pike one morning while they were sorting pelts from the trap lines. He'd been working despite the heat, despite the cough that never fully went away, and Clara couldn't put it off any longer. "I'm pregnant," she said, no preamble. Pike's hand stilled on the pelt he'd been examining. He looked up at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You're sure?" 2 months missed. "And I've been sick in the mornings." Clara kept her voice level, businesslike. "So yes, I'm sure." Pike set down the pelt carefully, stood up. For a long moment he just looked at her, and Clara couldn't tell what he was thinking. Then his face broke into something she'd never seen before. A genuine smile, wide and unguarded, and so full of relief it made her chest ache. "A child," he said, almost wonderingly. "We did it." "We did." Pike crossed to her, pulled her into a hug that lifted her off her feet. Clara gasped, startled. He'd never done anything like this before, and then found herself laughing as he spun her around. "Careful," she said. "You'll pull your stitches." "They're healed." Pike set her down but kept his hands on her shoulders, his smile still in place. "This is good, Clara. This is real good." Looking at him, at the joy in his eyes, the way the constant tension in his shoulders had finally eased, Clara felt her own smile forming. She'd thought of the pregnancy as just fulfilling the contract, checking off another requirement. But seeing Pike's reaction, she realized it meant more than that. It meant he'd gotten what he wanted. The legacy he'd been building for 20 years would continue. Someone would carry his name, inherit this land, keep it alive after he was gone. And despite everything, despite the transactional nature of their arrangement, Clara found she was happy about it too. Not just for the security it guaranteed her, but for Pike. He'd earned this. Earned the chance to know his work wouldn't die with him. "We should celebrate," Pike said, still grinning like a fool. "I've got a bottle of real whiskey I've been saving. The good stuff from back east." "I probably shouldn't drink," Clara said. "Right, course not." Pike's grin dimmed slightly but didn't disappear. "Well, I'll drink for both of us. And tomorrow we start building a cradle." He did drink that night, sitting by the fire with Clara, talking more than she'd ever heard him talk. About his own childhood in Pennsylvania, before he'd run away at 16 to make his fortune in the mountains. About his father, a hard man who'd never approved of anything Pike did. About wanting to do better, be better, for this child who didn't even exist yet as anything more than a promise. Clara listened, watched the firelight play across his scarred face, and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Something that felt an awful lot like love. She tried to squash it, reminded herself this was temporary, that Pike was dying, that getting attached would only break her heart. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. Pike started building the cradle the next morning, working with a focus Clara had seen him apply to everything else. He used pine from his own land, wood he'd felled years ago and saved for something special. His hands moved with practiced skill, shaping and smoothing, checking and rechecking every joint. Clara watched him work between her own chores, watched the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the small smile that played at his lips when a piece fit perfectly. He was building this for his child with the same care he'd built everything else on this land. "Boy or girl," Pike said one evening, not looking up from the cradle, "I want them to know about this place, really know it. Not just the pretty parts, but the hard parts too. The work it takes, the respect it demands." "I'll teach them," Clara said quietly. Pike did look up then, his eyes finding hers. "I know you will. You're tougher than I gave you credit for when we started." "You didn't give me much credit at all." "No," Pike admitted. "I figured you'd last maybe a month before running back to town crying. I'm glad I was wrong." Clara moved closer, ran her hand over the smooth wood of the cradle. "I'm glad too." That night, when Pike came to her, it felt different. Less mechanical, less like checking off a requirement. He touched her like she was something precious, something worth savoring. And Clara touched him back the same way, memorizing the feel of him, the weight and warmth of his body against hers. Afterward, lying in the dark with Pike's arm around her and his hand resting on her still flat stomach, Clara let herself imagine a different version of this story. One where Pike wasn't dying, where they had years instead of months, where the strange marriage of convenience could grow into something real. But imagination didn't change reality. Pike's cough was getting worse, coming more frequently. Some mornings he could barely get out of bed, and the gray tinge to his skin had spread. He was fading, slow but steady, and nothing Clara did could stop it. Summer deepened into late July, hot and dry. Pike worked himself harder than ever, trying to get everything done before the baby came, before his body gave out entirely. He restocked the woodpile until it was twice as high as necessary, smoked enough meat to last the winter, reinforced the barn roof, fixed every little thing that might break while Clara was alone with a newborn. "You're going to kill yourself working this hard," Clara told him one scorching afternoon, watching him split logs despite the heat. "I'm dying anyway," Pike said flatly. "Might as well die useful." The words hit Clara like a slap. She'd been trying so hard not to think about it, to pretend they had more time than they did. But Pike had no such illusions. "How long?" she asked. Pike set down the axe, wiped sweat from his face. "Doc back in Stillwater gave me 6 months. That was 4 months ago, so maybe 2 more, maybe less. Depends on how mean my lungs want to be about it." 2 months. The baby wasn't due until February, by Clara's reckoning. Pike might not even be alive when his child was born. The thought made Clara's eyes burn, but she blinked the tears back. Crying wouldn't help anyone. Then we make the most of the time we have, she said. Pike looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Yeah, we do. They fell into a new rhythm after that, one shaped by the ticking clock neither of them could ignore. Pike taught Clara everything he could think of, cramming months of knowledge into weeks. How to repair the trap lines, how to preserve food for the long winter, how to treat common illnesses in the horses, how to navigate by the stars if she got lost. And Clara absorbed it all with desperate focus, knowing she'd need every bit of it to survive alone. But they also took time for smaller things. Pike showed Clara his favorite spots on the land, the high meadow where the view stretched for miles, the hidden pond where trout jumped at dusk, the old-growth forest where the trees were so thick barely any light got through. They'd sit in these places, not talking much, just being together in the quiet. Once Pike asked her to tell him about her parents. Clara barely remembered them. They died when she was 6, something about a fever that tore through their town, but she told him what little Aunt Ingrid had shared. Her father had been a carpenter, good with his hands. Her mother had loved music, had sung while she worked. I wish I could sing, Clara said, for the baby, but I never learned how. Then make up your own songs, Pike said. Doesn't matter if they're good, just matters that they're yours. It was one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to her. August brought storms that rolled through the valley like freight trains, violent and brief. Clara learned to love them, the way the lightning split the sky, the drum of rain on the cabin roof, the clean smell of the air afterward. Pike would stand at the window during the worst of it, watching the display with something like hunger in his eyes. This is when the mountains feel most alive, he told her once. When they're showing you what they can really do. Clara came to stand beside him, watched the lightning arc between peaks. Were you scared the first time you saw a storm like this? Terrified. I was 17, alone in a shelter I'd barely managed to build, convinced I was about to die. Pike smiled at the memory. But I didn't die. And the next storm, I was a little less scared. Eventually you realize the mountains aren't trying to kill you specifically. They're just being what they are. It's up to you to be smart enough to survive it. Is that your whole philosophy? Clara asked. Just be smart enough to survive. More or less. Pike glanced at her, his expression softer than usual in the lightning flash light. You're doing that, you know, surviving, thriving even. I see how you move now, how you think. You're not that scared girl from town anymore. Clara felt a surge of pride at his words, followed immediately by grief. Pike had done this, transformed her from nothing into someone capable, someone strong, and he'd be gone before she could fully thank him for it. I learned from the best, she said quietly. Pike's hand found hers, squeezed once. They stood there together until the storm passed, leaving the valley washed clean and gleaming. By September, Clara's pregnancy was starting to show. Nothing dramatic yet, just a slight rounding of her belly, but enough that her clothes didn't quite fit right anymore. Pike seemed fascinated by it, would rest his hand on her stomach sometimes like he was trying to feel the life growing inside. February, you think? He asked one evening. Maybe late January if we're lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. Clara covered his hand with hers. Winter babies are hard. Everything worth having is hard. Pike shifted closer, his warmth solid against her back. You'll manage. You manage everything else. Clara wanted to argue, to point out all the ways she still felt inadequate and terrified, but Pike's confidence in her was so absolute it seemed rude to contradict him. The first snow came in mid-October, light and tentative, dusting the peaks but melting by noon. Pike saw it and nodded like he'd been waiting for exactly that sign. We need to talk about what happens after, he said. Clara's stomach dropped. She'd been avoiding this conversation for months, hoping irrationally that if they never discussed Pike's death, it somehow wouldn't happen. All right, she managed. They sat at the table, the one Pike had built from a single massive pine, and he laid it all out with the same businesslike tone he used for everything practical. The land was legally Clara's the moment he died. The contract ensured that. Everything in the cabin, the barn, the equipment, the horses, all of it transferred to her. There was money buried under the floorboards in the storage room, enough to buy supplies for a few years if she was careful. The trap lines were marked on a map he'd drawn, detailed and accurate. You can sell it all and leave if you want, Pike said. I wouldn't blame you. This is a hard life, especially alone with a child. You could go somewhere easier. I'm not leaving, Clara said immediately. Pike looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. You say that now, but after I'm gone, after you've been through a winter alone, you might change your mind. I won't. Clara reached across the table, took his hand. It felt frailer than it had months ago, the bones too prominent. You gave me something no one else ever did. A chance, a future. I'm not throwing that away because it gets hard. Pike's fingers tightened on hers. This place, it means something to me. I know that's stupid, getting sentimental about dirt and trees, but I built this with my own hands. Every board, every nail. It's the only thing I've ever made that mattered. It's not stupid, Clara said fiercely. And I'll take care of it. I'll take care of our child. I promise. I know you will. Pike pulled his hand free, ran it over his face. When he looked at her again, his eyes were wet. I'm sorry I won't be here to see them grow up, to teach them all the things I planned to teach them. Clara's own tears spilled over and she didn't bother wiping them away. Tell me the things you wanted to teach them. I'll remember. I'll pass it on. So Pike talked, late into the night, about everything he'd wanted his child to know. How to read the forest, respect the land, survive the winters. How to be strong without being cruel. How to be kind without being weak. How to build something that lasted, something worth leaving behind. Clara listened and memorized every word, knowing these instructions were Pike's real legacy, more valuable than the land or the money or anything else he could give. When he finally ran out of words, exhausted from talking and coughing and grief, Clara helped him to bed. He fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing ragged but steady. Clara lay beside him, one hand on her growing belly, the other resting on Pike's chest so she could feel the rise and fall of his breath. And she made a silent vow to the child growing inside her, to the man dying beside her, to the mountains watching over them all. She would survive this. She would raise this child right. She would honor the legacy Pike had spent 20 years building. She would not let him down. October bled into November, and Pike's decline accelerated like a boulder rolling downhill. The cough, that had been a constant companion, turned vicious, racking his whole body until Clara could hear his ribs creak. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed without her help, and the gray tinge to his skin had deepened to something that looked like ash. But he kept working, kept pushing himself beyond what his body could reasonably handle, driven by the ticking clock only he could hear. You need to rest, Clara told him one afternoon, finding him in the barn trying to reinforce a support beam that didn't need reinforcing. I'll rest when I'm dead. Pike didn't look at her, just kept hammering. Which is coming soon enough without me lying around waiting for it. Pike, don't. He finally stopped, lowered the hammer, but still didn't turn around. Don't try to manage me like I'm already an invalid. I got things that need doing, and I'm doing them while I still can. Clara bit back her response, recognizing the fear beneath his anger. Pike wasn't afraid of dying. He'd made his peace with that months ago. But he was terrified of dying useless, of wasting whatever time he had left. So she stopped trying to make him rest and started working alongside him instead. They reinforced the barn together, patched the cabin roof, organized the supplies for the 100th time. Clara's belly was round and obvious now, making the work harder, but she refused to slow down. If Pike could work half dead, she could work pregnant. The first real snow came in mid-November, heavy and fast. Clara woke to a world transformed, everything buried under 2 feet of white that sparkled in the weak morning sun. The mountains had disappeared behind the storm, and the silence was so complete it felt like they were the only people left alive. Pike stood at the window, watching the snow with an expression Clara couldn't read. Beautiful, isn't it? She said, coming to stand beside him. It's a coffin lid closing. Pike's voice was flat. Another winter. I didn't think I'd see another winter. Clara's hand found his, squeezed. You're still here. Barely. He glanced down at their joined hands, then at her swollen belly. The baby's coming soon. I can see it in how you're carrying. Maybe 6 weeks. Maybe less. The midwife in Stillwater said February. The midwife in Stillwater's never been up here in winter. Babies come when they want to come, and this one feels early to me. Pike turned to face her fully. I need to teach you what to do when the time comes, because I might not be conscious enough to help, and there's no one else." The thought of giving birth alone in the wilderness with only a dying man for company sent ice through Clara's veins, but she'd known this was coming, had known from the moment she'd agreed to Pike's bargain that it would be brutal. "All right," she said, "teach me." They spent the next week going over everything Pike knew about childbirth, which was more than Clara expected. He'd helped birth foals and calves, had even assisted once when a trapper's wife went into labor early on the trail. It wasn't the same as human birth, he admitted, but the basics were universal. "The main thing is not to panic," Pike said, demonstrating on a spare blanket rolled into a crude approximation of a baby. "Your body knows what to do. You just have to trust it and not fight it." Easy for you to say. Nothing about this is easy, but you're tough enough. Pike set down the blanket, looked at her seriously. "I need you to promise me something. If it comes down to a choice between you and the baby, you choose yourself. You understand?" Clara's throat tightened. "Pike, promise me, Clara. The baby needs you to survive, and I need—" His voice cracked. "I need to know you'll be all right, even if I'm not here to see it." "I promise," Clara whispered. Pike nodded, satisfied, and went back to his instructions. But Clara saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear that lived in her own chest. They were playing a dangerous game with dangerous stakes, and there was no guarantee any of them would survive it. December came in cold and mean. The temperature dropped so low that water left out overnight froze solid in minutes. The horses huddled in the barn, and Clara and Pike barely left the cabin except to tend them and check the trap lines. Pike's condition worsened daily. He could barely eat, the coughing fits lasting so long Clara was sure he'd break something. His skin had gone translucent, blue veins visible beneath the surface like rivers on a map. Some days he was lucid and sharp. Other days he barely knew where he was. On his good days, he'd talk to Clara's belly, tell their unborn child stories about the mountains, about the life waiting for them. On his bad days, he'd sleep fitfully, fever dreams making him thrash and mutter. Clara cared for him with a tenderness that surprised her. She'd thought the marriage would stay transactional, that she'd never feel more than gratitude for the opportunity Pike had given her. But somewhere along the way, between the shooting lessons and the quiet evenings and the nights when he'd held her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world, she'd fallen in love with him. Not the dramatic, storybook kind, the real kind. The kind that hurt because you knew it was temporary, that you were watching someone you loved slip away and couldn't do anything to stop it. "I wish we'd had more time," she told him one night, lying beside him in the dark. Pike's breathing was labored, each inhale a struggle, but his hand found hers under the blankets. "We had what we had," he rasped. "That's more than most people get. It's not enough. It never is." Pike shifted, managed to turn his head to look at her. Even in the darkness, Clara could see the gleam of his eyes. "But I'm grateful for it anyway. For you. You made this last year worth living." Clara felt the tears come, hot and fast, and didn't try to stop them. "I love you. I know that's not part of the deal, but I do." Pike's hand tightened on hers. "I know, I love you too. Didn't plan on it, but there it is." They lay there in the darkness, holding on to each other, knowing the end was close but not yet here. And for that moment, it was enough. Christmas passed without ceremony. They had no decorations, no special food, no reason to mark the day beyond noting its passage. But Pike managed to carve a small wooden horse for the baby, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 days. When he finished, he pressed it into Clara's hands with something like triumph. "First toy," he said. "Every kid needs a horse." Clara turned the carving over in her hands, feeling the smooth wood, the careful details despite Pike's deteriorating condition. It was lopsided and rough, nowhere near as fine as the cradle, but it was made with love, and that made it perfect. "Thank you," she whispered. "Teach them to ride young," Pike said. "Soon as they can walk. A kid who can ride is a kid who can survive out here." "I will." Pike nodded, exhausted from the effort of carving, and fell asleep sitting up. Clara eased him down, covered him with extra blankets, and added the wooden horse to the small collection of baby things they'd accumulated. A cradle. A few blankets Clara had sewn. The horse. Not much, but it would have to be enough. The new year arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days straight. Clara could barely see the barn from the cabin window, the world reduced to howling white. Pike slept through most of it, barely waking long enough to take water and broth. Clara worked constantly, keeping the fire going, melting snow for water, tending the horses who were getting increasingly anxious in their confinement. Her back ached from the pregnancy and the baby kicked constantly now, running out of room. On the third night of the blizzard, Pike woke lucid for the first time in days. Clara was dozing by the fire, exhausted, when his voice cut through the wind. "Clara!" She jerked awake, scrambled to his side. "I'm here. What do you need?" "Nothing. Pike struggled to sit up, and Clara helped him, propping pillows behind his back. "I wanted to see you, really see you, not in a fever dream." Clara took his hand, shocked by how cold it was despite the blankets. "I'm right here." Pike looked at her for a long moment, his eyes tracing her face like he was memorizing it. "You're going to be fine. You know that, right? You're strong enough for what's coming. Don't talk like you're already gone." "I am, though, mostly." He managed a weak smile. "Just haven't had the courtesy to stop breathing yet." Clara's grip on his hand tightened. "Then keep breathing, for as long as you can. I'll try." Pike's other hand moved to her belly, resting there gently. "I wish I could meet them. See what they look like. Know if they got your eyes or mine." "They'll have your stubbornness, that's for certain." Pike laughed, which turned into a coughing fit that lasted 2 minutes. When it finally subsided, blood flecked his lips. Clara wiped it away with a cloth, her heart breaking. "I need you to know something," Pike said when he could speak again. "This year with you, it was the best year of my life. Even dying, even knowing how it ends, you made me happier than I had any right to be." "Pike, let me finish." He squeezed her hand weakly. "I know this started as a deal, a transaction, but somewhere along the way it became real for me. You became real. And I'm grateful for that. For you. For all of it." Clara was crying now, ugly sobs she couldn't control. "I'm grateful too. For everything. You saved my life." "You saved mine too, just in a different way." Pike pulled her down, kissed her forehead with lips that felt like paper. "Don't mourn me too long, all right? You got a baby to raise and a life to live. Don't waste it crying over a dead man." "I'll cry if I want to." "Fair enough?" Pike settled back against the pillows, his breathing already laboring from the brief conversation. "Stay with me tonight. I don't want to be alone." "I'm not going anywhere." Clara climbed into bed beside him, careful of his fragile body, and held him as gently as she could. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, Pike's breathing slowly evened out into sleep. Clara stayed awake, listening to each breath, counting them like precious coins, knowing that each one might be the last. The blizzard broke on the 4th day, leaving the valley buried under 4 feet of snow. Clara woke to weak sunlight and the realization that Pike's breathing had changed. It was shallower now, more irregular. The sound of a body beginning to shut down. She got up, built up the fire, made coffee she knew Pike wouldn't drink. Her body felt heavy, unwieldy, the baby pressing down in a way that made every movement awkward. She was running out of time too, in her own way. Pike woke around noon, his eyes glazed with fever. He didn't seem to recognize Clara at first, kept calling her by a name she didn't know. But eventually his gaze cleared, focused on her. "How long was I out?" "Most of the night, all morning." Clara brought him water, held the cup to his lips. He managed 2 sips. "The storm's over?" "Just." Pike nodded weakly. "Good. I didn't want you snowed in with a corpse." "You're not dead yet." "Close enough." He closed his eyes. "It won't be long now, Clara. I can feel it. Everything's shutting down." Clara wanted to argue, to insist he had more time, but she could see the truth in his face. Pike was right. Days, maybe. Hours, possibly. "What do you need?" she asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Nothing. Just you here." Pike's hand found hers, the grip barely there. "And Clara? Don't wait too long to bury me. The ground's frozen, but there's a spot behind the cabin where the snow doesn't drift as deep. You should be able to dig there." The practicality of it, the calm acceptance, made Clara want to scream, but she just nodded. I'll take care of it. I know you will. You take care of everything. They sat in silence for a while, Pike drifting in and out of consciousness, Clara holding his hand and trying to memorize everything about him. The calluses on his palms, the scar above his left eyebrow, the gray hair at his temples. All the small details that made him real, that proved he'd existed. That evening, Pike rallied slightly, enough to eat a few spoonfuls of broth, enough to talk in short bursts between coughing fits. "The money," he said. "Under the floorboards in the storage room, northeast corner, there's a loose board. Pull it up." "I remember, you told me." "And the map, in the desk, shows every trap line, every safe path, every water source. You study that map until you know it by heart." "I will." "And the rifle. Keep it clean, keep it loaded. Don't hesitate if you need to use it." "Pike, I know all this. You've told me a dozen times, so—" He looked at her, eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "I need to know you'll survive. That's all that matters now, your survival." "I'll survive," Clara promised. "I'll survive, and I'll raise our child and I'll make you proud." "You already make me proud." Pike's eyes were wet. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Clara Pike. Don't you forget that." Clara couldn't speak around the lump in her throat, so she just kissed him, soft and gentle, tasting salt from both their tears. That night, Clara woke to Pike's hand on her shoulder. His breathing was harsh, labored, each inhale sounding like gravel in a bucket. "It's time," he whispered. Clara's heart seized. "No, not yet. You still have—" "Clara." Pike's voice was firm despite its weakness. "It's time. I can feel it." She sat up, lit the lamp with shaking hands. In the yellow light, Pike looked almost translucent, like he was already halfway to being a ghost. "What do you need?" she asked. "Just talk to me. Tell me about the baby. What you hope for them." Clara settled beside him, one hand on her belly, the other holding Pike's. "I hope they're strong like you, brave. I hope they love this land the way you do, see the beauty in it even when it's hard. I hope they know how much their father wanted them, how much he sacrificed to make sure they'd have a legacy." Pike smiled, a real smile despite the pain etched in every line of his face. "That's good. That's real good." "I hope they have your eyes," Clara continued, the words flowing now. "And your hands. I hope they can build things, make things, create something lasting. I hope they understand that survival isn't enough. You have to live too, really live." "You'll teach them that," Pike said. "You'll teach them everything they need to know." His breathing was getting worse, each inhale a battle. Clara could see the exact moment he started losing, the light in his eyes beginning to dim. "Pike, it's all right," he whispered. "I'm ready. I'm tired, Clara. So tired. I know you are." Clara was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay to rest. You've done enough. You've done more than enough." Pike's eyes found hers one last time. "Take care of our baby." "I will. I promise." "And take care of yourself. Please." "I will." Pike nodded, satisfied. His hand squeezed hers one final time, then relaxed. His breathing slowed, each gap between inhales growing longer. Clara held him as the night deepened, talking softly about nothing and everything. About the mountains, about the life their child would have, about all the things Pike would miss but wouldn't regret, because he'd lived fully in the time he'd had. Just before dawn, Pike took a breath. Then another. Then nothing. Clara waited, hoping for one more, but it didn't come. Pike was gone, his body finally still after months of fighting. She sat there as the sun rose, painting the snow outside gold and pink, holding the hand of the man who'd saved her life by giving her his. And she let herself grieve, deep and raw, for the love she'd found and lost in the space of a single year. But she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Not yet. There was work to be done. Clara laid Pike out properly, washed his body and dressed him in his best clothes. It took her hours, her pregnant body making every movement difficult, but she did it anyway. He deserved that much. She wrapped him in a clean blanket, then faced the impossible task of burial. The ground was frozen solid, the snow deep, and she was 7 months pregnant. But Pike had been right about the spot behind the cabin. The snow was shallower there, maybe only 2 feet. It took Clara 3 days to dig the grave. 3 days of chopping through frozen earth with a pickaxe, her back screaming, the baby protesting every jarring movement. She'd dig for an hour, rest for 2, then dig again. Slow, methodical, refusing to quit. On the 3rd day, she had a hole deep enough. Not as deep as it should be, but deep enough that the wolves wouldn't dig him up. She couldn't lift Pike's body alone, so she wrapped it in canvas and dragged it on a sled she'd rigged up. Every pull sent pain shooting through her lower back, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Getting him into the grave was the hardest part. Clara had to half fall into the hole herself, position his body, then claw her way back out. By the time she was done, she was covered in mud and snow, crying and cursing and completely exhausted. But Pike was in the ground. That was what mattered. Clara stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the canvas-wrapped shape that had been her husband, and tried to find words. But everything that came to mind felt inadequate, too small for what Pike had been. Finally, she just said, "Thank you for everything. I'll keep my promises." Then she filled in the grave, one frozen shovelful at a time. By the time she finished, it was dark and Clara could barely stand. She stumbled back to the cabin, every muscle screaming, and collapsed on the bed that still smelled like Pike. She should eat, should drink water, should do a dozen things to take care of herself. Instead, she curled up on Pike's side of the bed and cried until she had nothing left. She woke to pain. Not the grief pain that had been her constant companion for days, but something different, something physical and urgent and completely terrifying. Her water had broken, soaking the bed beneath her, and her belly was contracting hard and rhythmic, a vice squeezing tighter with each wave. The baby was coming. Claire's first thought was that it was too early. She should have at least another month, maybe 6 weeks. Her second thought was that Pike had called it. Babies came when they wanted to come, and this one had decided now was the time. Her third thought was that she was completely alone, in the middle of winter, in the middle of nowhere, and if anything went wrong, she would die. Clara forced herself to breathe through the panic, through the contraction that made her want to scream. She'd promised Pike she would survive. She'd promised herself she would raise this child. Breaking those promises wasn't an option. She got out of bed, slowly, carefully, and started preparing. Fresh water from the barrel by the door. Clean cloth for the baby. The knife Pike had told her to use to cut the cord, sterilized in the fire. Everything laid out within reach of the bed. The contractions were coming faster now, closer together. Clara changed into her oldest dress, the one she wouldn't mind ruining, and tried to remember everything Pike had taught her. Don't panic. Trust your body. Let it happen. Easy for him to say. He'd never had to do this alone. The labor lasted all night and into the next day. Hours of pain that blurred together into one endless ordeal. Clara walked when she could, paced the small cabin, gripped the bedpost when the contractions got so bad she couldn't breathe through them. She talked to Pike sometimes, imagined he was there coaching her through it. Imagined his voice telling her she was strong enough, she could do this, just a little bit longer. When the urge to push finally came, Clara barely made it to the bed. The pain was blinding, all-consuming, worse than anything she'd ever imagined. She screamed, not caring that no one would hear, and pushed with everything she had. The baby came in a rush of blood and fluid, sliding into Clara's shaking hands. For a terrifying moment, it didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then it let out a thin, angry wail, and Clara started crying all over again, but this time from relief. She had a son, red-faced and furious and absolutely perfect. She cleaned him quickly, clumsily, wrapped him in the blanket she'd prepared. The cord was still attached, pulsing weakly. Clara waited like Pike had told her, then cut it with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped the knife. The placenta came a few minutes later, and Clara dealt with it on autopilot, her mind focused entirely on the screaming bundle in her arms. Her son. Pike's son. The heir they'd bargained for, fought for, survived for. "Caleb," Clara whispered, the name coming to her without thought. "Your name is Caleb Pike. I'll keep you safe," she whispered. "I'll make you strong. I'll teach you everything your father wanted you to know, and I'll make sure you understand what he sacrificed to give you this life." Caleb yawned, his eyes closing in exhausted sleep. Clara kissed his forehead, breathed in his new baby smell, and let herself feel something like hope. The worst was over. They'd both survived. Now the real work could begin. The first week with Caleb nearly broke Clara in ways the labor hadn't. He cried constantly, that thin newborn wail that cut straight through to her bones. Clara had no idea if she was doing anything right. Was he getting enough milk? Too much? Was he too cold, too hot, sick, dying? Every whimper sent her into a panic she barely managed to hide from herself. And she was alone. Completely, utterly alone. No Aunt Ingrid to ask for advice, no Mrs. Chen to offer knowing looks and practical help, no Pike to tell her she was doing fine. Just Clara and a screaming infant in a cabin that felt smaller and colder every day. The exhaustion was worse than anything she'd experienced. Claire would fall asleep for what felt like seconds before Caleb needed feeding again. Her body ached from the birth, still bleeding and sore, and every movement reminded her that she'd torn herself apart bringing this child into the world. But she kept going, fed him when he cried, changed the cloth diapers she'd sewn from old sheets, held him when he seemed inconsolable, kept the fire burning, melted snow for water, forced herself to eat even when her stomach rebelled. On the 8th day, Clara woke to silence, pure, complete silence. She bolted upright, terror flooding through her. Caleb wasn't crying, wasn't moving. She grabbed him from the cradle Pike had built, her hands shaking, expecting to find him cold and still. Instead, he blinked up at her with dark eyes that were definitely Pike's, and yawned. Just sleeping. He'd just been sleeping. Clara sat down hard on the bed, Caleb cradled against her chest, and started laughing. The sound was slightly hysterical, edged with tears, but it felt good. She was losing her mind, clearly, but at least Caleb was alive. "You're going to give me a heart attack," she told him, "just like your father." Caleb made a small noise, something between a grunt and a sigh, and Clara felt her heart twist. He did that sometimes, made sounds or faces that reminded her so sharply of Pike it hurt to breathe. She'd been trying not to think about Pike too much, trying to focus on survival, on getting through each day. But in the quiet moments, when Caleb slept and the cabin felt too empty, the grief would hit her like a physical blow. Pike should be here, should be seeing his son, holding him, teaching Clara what to do. Instead, there was just a grave behind the cabin and a hole in Clara's chest that wouldn't close. But grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. Maybe not ever. By the end of the 2nd week, Clara had developed a routine of sorts. Feed Caleb every few hours, sleep when he slept, check the horses twice a day, keep the fire going, eat something even if it was just jerky and hardtack. The routine kept her sane, gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together into one endless cycle of exhaustion. The horses were her biggest worry after Caleb. They needed feeding, watering, exercise they weren't getting in the deep snow. Clara did what she could, but it wasn't enough. She could see them getting restless, stressed from confinement. "I know," she told them one morning, forking hay into their stalls with Caleb strapped to her chest in a sling she'd rigged from blankets. "I know this isn't enough, but it's what I've got." The mare, the one Pike had bought for Clara back in Stillwater, nudged her shoulder gently. Clara leaned into the warmth of the horse, feeling tears prick her eyes. "I miss him too," she whispered. February brought more snow and temperatures so cold that Clara's breath froze on her scarf. Going outside meant wrapping Caleb in so many layers he looked like a small, angry burrito. But Clara had to check the trap lines eventually. They were a source of income she couldn't ignore, and Pike had been adamant about keeping them maintained. The first time she tried to snowshoe out to the nearest line with Caleb, she made it maybe 50 yards before her legs gave out. She stood there in the waist-deep snow, gasping for air, Caleb crying against her chest, and wondered if she'd actually survive this after all. But she turned around, went back to the cabin, and tried again the next day. And the day after that. Each time going a little farther before exhaustion forced her back. By the end of February, she could reach the closest trap line and back, though it took most of the day and left her so tired she could barely stand. The traps had frozen solid, unusable until the spring thaw, but at least Clara knew where they were now, had walked the path enough times to find it even in the snow. Small victories. That's what Pike would have called them, and Clara took every one she could get. March arrived with the first hints that winter might eventually end. The days grew fractionally longer, the sun stronger. The snow started to settle and compact, making travel slightly easier. And Caleb, miraculously, started sleeping for longer stretches at night. Clara used those precious hours of sleep to dream about Pike. Sometimes good dreams, him showing her the land, teaching her to shoot, holding her by the fire. Sometimes terrible ones, him dying over and over, or already dead and angry that she'd failed him somehow. She'd wake from those nightmares gasping, heart racing, and have to go stand by Caleb's cradle just to remind herself that she'd done it, had given Pike the air he wanted, had survived the birth, had kept them both alive through the worst of winter. On a clear morning in mid-March, Clara bundled Caleb up and took him outside for the first time since his birth. The sun was bright on the snow, painful to look at, but the air had lost some of its knife-edge cold. "This is your land," Clara told him, turning slowly so he could see the valley spread out before them. Not that Caleb could actually see much. He was 2 months old and mostly interested in eating and sleeping. But Clara needed to say it anyway. "Your father built all this, the cabin, the barn, everything. He did it so you'd have a home, so you'd have something solid to stand on." Caleb squinted in the bright light, made a small, unhappy sound. I know. It's cold and you don't care." Clara pulled him closer. "But someday you will. Someday you'll understand what he gave you, what he gave us both." A raven called from the trees, harsh and loud. Clara scanned the tree line automatically, a habit Pike had drilled into her. Always watch, always stay alert. The mountains didn't care about your grief or your exhaustion. She saw movement then, just a flash of brown against the white. Her hand went to the rifle slung across her back before she'd even processed what she was seeing. A deer. Just a deer, picking its way through the snow. Clara's heart rate slowly returned to normal. She was jumpy, had been since Pike died. Saw threats in every shadow, heard danger in every sound. It would pass, probably. Or it wouldn't. Either way, it kept her alive. Back inside, Clara settled Caleb in his cradle and pulled out the money Pike had hidden under the floorboards. She counted it for the dozenth time, trying to calculate how long it would last. Not long enough. That was the brutal truth. Pike had saved what he could, but it wasn't infinite. Eventually, probably by next winter, Clara would need to sell furs, or make the trip down to trade, or find some other way to generate income. The thought of leaving the valley, even for a few days, filled her with dread. What if something happened to Caleb while she was gone? What if the cabin caught fire, or wolves got into the barn, or any of the 1,000 other disasters her tired brain could conjure? But staying here forever, isolated and slowly running out of supplies, wasn't sustainable either. Clara put the money away and tried not to think about it. One problem at a time. That's all she could handle. Spring arrived properly in April, the snow melting into rushing streams that turned the valley into a muddy mess. Clara could finally check the trap lines for real, though she had to bring Caleb with her in his sling, which made the work twice as hard. The first few traps were empty or had been sprung by animals too small to bother with. But the fourth trap held a marten, its pelt thick and dark, and probably worth a decent amount at the trading post. Clara reset the trap with hands that remembered Pike's instructions, and hiked back to the cabin with the dead marten and a sense of accomplishment that felt disproportionate to the task. She skinned and stretched the pelt that evening while Caleb slept, working by lamplight, making mistakes Pike would have corrected, but doing her best anyway. It wasn't perfect. The pelt had a few knife marks where she'd been too aggressive, but it was done. "First fur," she told Caleb the next morning. "Your father would probably say it's sloppy work, but it's mine." Over the next few weeks, Clara worked the trap lines methodically, building up a small collection of pelts. Marten, fox, a few beaver from the creek. Nothing spectacular, but enough to maybe trade for supplies come fall. She also started a garden, turning over the soil in the small plot behind the cabin that Pike had used in previous years. Her back ached from the work, and Caleb fussed in his cradle nearby, but Clara kept at it. They'd need vegetables come winter, and she wasn't about to let Pike's careful planning go to waste. Planting the seeds, potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, felt like an act of faith. Faith that she'd still be here in the fall to harvest them, that Caleb would still be alive and growing, that this life Pike had built for them would hold. By May, the valley had transformed completely. Green everywhere, flowers blooming in impossible profusion. The meadow grass growing so fast Claire could almost watch it. The horses were ecstatic, finally able to graze freely after months of confinement. Caleb was changing too, growing heavier, more alert, starting to focus on faces and track movement with his eyes. He still cried plenty, but he also made other sounds now, little coos and grunts that made Clara's heart squeeze. She talked to him constantly, narrated everything she did, partly because the silence made her crazy, partly because Pike had said babies needed to hear voices to learn language properly. So Clara talked about the weather, the horses, the work she was doing, the land around them. And she talked about Pike, told Caleb stories about his father, even though he was too young to understand. It felt important somehow, keeping Pike's memory alive in words, even if Caleb couldn't remember him any other way. Your father could track a mouse through a snowstorm, Clara said one afternoon, weeding the garden with Caleb on a blanket beside her. He knew these mountains better than anyone alive. And he was stubborn as hell. You got that from him, I can already tell. Caleb grabbed his own foot, tried to eat it. He wanted you so much, Clara continued, her voice catching. He was dying, and he still wanted to make sure you'd have a future. Everything you see here, he built it for you, so you'd never have to struggle the way he did. The way I did. A shadow fell across them, and Clara's hand went automatically to the knife at her belt before she saw it was just a cloud passing over the sun. Still jumpy. Still seeing threats everywhere. She forced herself to breathe, to relax. They were fine. They were safe. Nothing was coming to hurt them. But a week later, something did come. Clara was inside making bread, or trying to, the dough wasn't cooperating, when she heard the horses whinny in alarm. Not their normal sounds, the kind of noise that meant danger. She grabbed the rifle, checked that Caleb was secure in his cradle, and moved to the window. 3 men on horseback were riding into the valley. Clara's stomach dropped. In the 8 months since she and Pike had arrived, they hadn't seen another soul. The valley was remote, far off any established trails, the kind of place you only found if you were looking for it specifically. These men were looking for something. Clara watched them approach, her finger on the trigger, trying to assess the threat. They were rough-looking, the kind of men who lived hard and expected nothing from anyone. Trappers, maybe, or prospectors. Their horses were lean, their clothes worn. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, clearly having spotted the smoke from the chimney. One of them, older, with a gray beard, called out, "Hello, the cabin! We're friendly, just looking for shelter and maybe some coffee." Clara didn't move. Pike had warned her about this, about strangers showing up and claiming to be friendly. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. And Clara was alone with an infant, which made her vulnerable in ways these men would definitely notice. "I'm armed," she called back, "and I don't have much hospitality for unexpected guests." The men exchanged glances, the one with the gray beard dismounted slowly, hands visible. "Fair enough. We don't mean any trouble. Name's Jack Sutter. These are my partners, Ben and Charlie. We've been working claims up north, heading back to Stillwater to resupply. This looked like good country to camp for the night, but if you'd rather we move on, we will." Clara's mind raced. If she turned them away, they might leave peacefully, or they might come back after dark, angry and determined. If she let them stay, they might be genuinely friendly, or they might rob her, hurt her, worse. "You knew Rowan Pike," the man, Jack, asked suddenly. "This is his land, isn't it? We ran into him a few times over the years. Good man, hard man, but fair." The mention of Pike's name made Clara's decision. If these men knew Pike, respected him, they might extend that respect to his widow. Might. "Rowan was my husband," Clara said, still not lowering the rifle. "He died in January. It's just me and my son now." The 3 men went quiet. Jack shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Pike was, well, he was a legend around these parts. Shame to lose him." "Yeah." Clara's throat tightened. "It is." "Look," Jack said, his tone gentler, "we really don't mean any trouble. We can camp down by the creek if you want us away from the cabin. We just need to rest the horses, maybe refill our water. We'll be gone by morning." Clara studied them for another long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she lowered the rifle slightly. "You camp by the creek. Don't come near the cabin unless I invite you. And if any of you try anything, I will shoot you. I'm not as good a shot as Pike was, but I'm good enough." Jack nodded, looking almost relieved. "That's fair? Thank you, ma'am." The three men led their horses toward the creek, giving the cabin a wide berth. Clara watched until they were settled, then went inside and locked the door. Her hands were shaking. Caleb had started crying, probably picking up on her stress, and Clara scooped him up, held him close while trying to slow her racing heart. She'd handled that all right, hadn't panicked, hadn't made herself an easy target. Pike would have been, well, maybe not proud, but satisfied. But the encounter had reminded her of something she'd been trying to ignore. She couldn't stay hidden here forever. Eventually, word would spread that Pike was dead, that his widow was alone with a child on valuable land. And people would come, some with good intentions, some without. Clara needed to be ready for that, needed to be strong enough, hard enough, to protect what was hers. She spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the window every few minutes, rifle close at hand. The men stayed by the creek, built a fire. Seemed to be doing exactly what they'd said they would. Just before sunset, Jack approached the cabin again, stopping a respectful distance away. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for your hospitality. We're settled for the night, won't bother you again. But I also wanted to say, if you ever need help, if you're ever in Stillwater and need someone to vouch for you, you can use my name. Me and Pike, we had a few dealings over the years. He helped me out of a tight spot once. I won't forget that." Clara came to the door, still wary. "Why would I need someone to vouch for me?" Jack's expression turned uncomfortable. "Well, ma'am, it's just, you're a woman alone on prime land. Pike didn't have any family that I know of, which means when he died, this should have gone to the territory to auction off. Some folks might question your claim to it." Clara's blood went cold. "I'm his legal widow. We were married. I have papers." "I believe you," Jack said quickly. "But you might want to make sure those papers are filed proper with the territory office, just to be safe. There's men who'd love to get their hands on land like this, and they'll use any excuse to challenge your ownership." Clara thought about the contract she and Pike had signed, still tucked away in the desk drawer. A private contract, witnessed by nobodies in Stillwater, never officially filed anywhere. "Thank you for the warning," she said tightly. Jack nodded. "We'll be gone by first light. And ma'am, for what it's worth, Pike chose well. Takes a hell of a woman to survive out here alone. I can see why he trusted you." He walked back to his camp before Clara could respond. She spent that night barely sleeping, Caleb in bed beside her, rifle within reach, listening to every sound from outside. But the men kept their word. By dawn they were packed and riding out, giving Clara a respectful nod as they passed. After they left, Clara sat at the table with the contract spread in front of her and faced the ugly truth. She had a legal claim to this land, but legal only mattered if someone enforced it. And if men with better connections or more money decided to challenge her, she might lose everything. She couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't let Pike's legacy get stolen by opportunistic bastards who'd never set foot in these mountains. But fighting a legal battle meant going to Stillwater, maybe even the territorial capital. It meant leaving the valley, taking Caleb into civilization, facing people who'd probably treat her the same way they had before, like she was nothing, except she wasn't nothing anymore. She was Rowan Pike's widow, mother to his son, owner of some of the best land in the territory. And if anyone tried to take that from her, she'd make them regret it. The decision crystallized over the next few weeks. Clara would go to Stillwater in late summer before the fall storms hit. She'd file the paperwork properly, make her ownership official, and dare anyone to challenge her. But first she needed to make sure the homestead could survive without her. That meant working harder than ever, preparing for every possible disaster. Clara threw herself into the work with a focus that bordered on obsession. She hunted and smoked meat, tended the garden obsessively, repaired every piece of equipment, organized and reorganized the supplies. She practiced with the rifle until her shoulder was one massive bruise, forcing herself to get better, faster, deadlier. And she cared for Caleb, who was growing at a rate that astonished her. By June, he was holding his head up, reaching for things, babbling nonsense that sometimes almost sounded like words. He had Pike's dark eyes and stubborn chin, but Clara's lighter hair and the same slight build she'd had as a child. "You're going to be tall like your father," Clara told him one morning, measuring him against the marks Pike had carved into the doorframe to track deer growth. Strong like him, too. I'll make sure of it. Caleb grabbed her nose, squealed with delight when she pretended to bite his fingers. These moments, the small domestic ones, were what kept Clara sane, what reminded her that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, building something, raising a child who would grow up knowing he was loved and wanted. By July, the garden was thriving beyond Clara's expectations. She'd have more vegetables than she could possibly use, which meant she could trade the surplus. The pelts from spring were properly cured and bundled, ready to sell. And Clara herself had changed in ways she only half recognized. She was lean now, all the softness burned away by constant work. Her hands were scarred and calloused, her skin darkened by the sun. She moved differently too, more confidently, more efficiently, like someone who knew exactly what her body could do and wasn't afraid to use it. She was becoming what Pike had been trying to make her, someone who could survive anything this land threw at her. In mid-August, Clara made her final preparations for the trip to Stillwater. She'd be gone at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather turned. She loaded the pack horses with furs and dried goods to trade, secured the cabin as best she could, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. The night before she left, Clara stood at Pike's grave with Caleb in her arms. "I'm going to fight for this," she told the wooden marker she'd carved with Pike's name and dates. "I'm going to make sure no one takes it from us. From him." She touched the grave marker, rough wood under her fingers. "I wish you were here. I wish you could see what I've done with the place. See Caleb. He's got your scowl already. You'd love it." The wind moved through the pines, and for just a moment Clara could almost imagine it was Pike's voice, telling her she'd do fine, that she was strong enough. She wanted to believe it. The ride down to Stillwater took 4 days with Caleb, slower than Clara had hoped, but as fast as she dared push. The town hadn't changed at all. Same muddy streets, same tired buildings, same people who looked at her like she was something they'd scraped off their boots. Except this time, Clara didn't care what they thought. She went straight to the land office, contract in hand, and demanded to speak to whoever handled territorial claims. The clerk, a pinched-faced man who looked like he'd never smiled in his life, barely glanced at her paperwork before shaking his head. "This isn't properly filed, and even if it was, there's questions about whether Pike had the right to deed the land at all. It might be public territory." "It's not public territory," Clara said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "Pike held that land for 20 years. He has senior claim. Claims need to be filed and maintained. I don't see any records of—" "Then you're not looking hard enough." Clara leaned forward, Caleb heavy in the sling against her chest. "That land belongs to my son. It's his inheritance from his father, and if you or anyone else tries to take it, I will make your life a living hell. Do you understand me?" The clerk blinked, clearly unused to being threatened by women holding babies. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my—" "File the paperwork," Claire interrupted. "Properly, today. And if I hear that someone's contesting the claim, I want to know about it immediately. Can you do that?" The clerk looked at her for a long moment, seemed to see something that made him reconsider his dismissive attitude. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." "Good." Clara straightened, adjusted Caleb's position. "I'll be at the boarding house if you need me, but I expect this to be handled quickly and correctly." She left before the clerk could respond, her heart hammering but her head high. Mrs. Chen was shocked to see her, shocked Clara was alive, shocked she had a baby, shocked she'd come back to Stillwater at all. "I heard you married Pike," Mrs. Chen said, ushering Clara inside. "Then I heard he died. Wasn't sure what happened to you." "I survived," Clara said simply. She stayed in Stillwater for 10 days, the longest 10 days of her life. She sold her furs and trade goods, bought supplies she couldn't make herself, and checked with the land office daily until the clerk assured her the paperwork was filed and legally binding. She also ran into Thomas Graves, inevitably, outside the mercantile. He looked her up and down, his expression somewhere between shock and disdain. "Well, well, Clara Hayes. Or is it Pike now?" "It's Pike," Clara said coldly. "Heard your husband died. Shame." Thomas didn't sound like he thought it was a shame at all. "What are you going to do now? Can't imagine you can manage that land alone." Clara shifted Caleb to her other hip, met Thomas's eyes directly. "I'm managing just fine. For now, maybe. But winter's coming, and you're what? 100 pounds? You'll be dead before spring or running back here begging for help." Something in Clara snapped. All the fear, all the grief, all the exhaustion of the past 8 months crystallized into pure rage. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her voice low and deadly calm. "I buried my husband in frozen ground. I gave birth alone in a wilderness cabin. I've survived things that would kill you in a day. So don't you dare stand there and tell me what I can't do." Thomas took a step back, actually looking nervous. "I'm not that scared girl you used to mock," Claire continued. "I'm Rowan Pike's widow, and I own some of the best land in this territory. And if you or anyone else tries to take it from me, I will put you in the ground next to him. Are we clear?" She didn't wait for an answer, just pushed past him into the mercantile. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding through her, but she felt good, powerful, like she'd finally shed the last piece of the person she used to be. Clara left Stillwater 2 days later with fresh supplies, legally filed paperwork, and a reputation that would ensure people thought twice before crossing her. The ride back to the valley felt different, felt like coming home. When she crested the final ridge and saw the cabin below, saw Pike's cabin, her cabin, Caleb's cabin, Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was hers, all of it, bought with suffering and loss and more strength than she'd known she possessed, and no one was taking it from her, ever. The trouble came in October, 3 weeks after the first snow. Clara was splitting wood behind the cabin, Caleb bundled in his cradle nearby where she could see him when she heard horses, multiple horses, coming up the trail from the valley entrance. She set down the axe, grabbed the rifle, and positioned herself where she had a clear line of sight. 5 riders this time, better dressed than the trappers who'd passed through in spring. One of them wore a suit that had no business being in the mountains. They stopped at the same spot the trappers had, surveying the property with eyes that made Clara's skin crawl. These weren't men looking for shelter. These were men looking for opportunity. The one in the suit dismounted, smoothed his jacket, and called out in a voice too smooth to be trustworthy. "Mrs. Pike, my name is Walter Bingham. I represent the Montana Land Development Company. I'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Clara didn't lower the rifle. "I'm not interested in business propositions. I think you'll want to hear this one." Bingham took a few steps closer, ignoring the way Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "We're prepared to offer you a very generous sum for this property, more money than you've probably ever seen, enough to set you and your child up comfortably in town, where you'd have help, community, civilization." I said I'm not interested. Bingham's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Pike, let's be realistic. You're a woman alone with an infant in the middle of nowhere. Winter's coming. Even if you survive this year, what about next year, the year after? How long before something goes wrong and you're found frozen to death come spring? That's my problem, not yours." "Actually, it is my problem." Bingham's tone hardened slightly. "Because when you die, and you will die, it's only a matter of time. This land goes into territorial receivership, at which point my company will purchase it anyway, but at a much lower price. So I'm offering you a chance to profit from the inevitable." Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and tight. "This land was my husband's. Now it's my son's. And it's not for sale at any price." "Your husband's claim was never properly filed until 2 months ago," Bingham said. "There are questions about its validity, questions my company is prepared to pursue legally if necessary. I filed the paperwork. It's legal and binding. Paperwork can be challenged. Claims can be contested." Bingham spread his hands in a gesture meant to seem reasonable. "Why put yourself through that fight? Take the money, Mrs. Pike. Take it and go somewhere your child will have a real future." One of the other riders, a thick-necked man who looked like he'd been hired more for muscle than brains, spoke up. "Lady's got a nice setup here, Mr. Bingham. Shame if something happened to it. Cabins catch fire all the time in winter. Real dangerous, living out here alone." The threat was barely veiled. Clara's hand steadied on the rifle, all her fear burning away into cold fury. "You need to leave," she said quietly. "Now." Bingham sighed like she was being unreasonable. "Mrs. Pike, I urge you to reconsider." Clara fired into the ground 3 feet in front of Bingham's expensive boots. The crack of the rifle echoed off the mountains, and Bingham stumbled backward, his face going white. "I said leave." Clara levered another round into the chamber. "The next one won't be a warning shot." The thick-necked man reached for his own rifle, but Bingham stopped him with a sharp gesture. They weren't ready for a fight today. They'd been expecting an easy intimidation, a scared woman ready to fold. "This isn't over," Bingham said, climbing back onto his horse with as much dignity as he could salvage. "You'll be hearing from us again, and next time we'll bring the territorial marshal. Bring whoever you want. This land is mine, and I'm not giving it up." The 5 men rode out, leaving Clara standing with the rifle still raised and Caleb crying from the sudden noise. She waited until they were completely out of sight before lowering the gun, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She'd bought herself time, but Bingham had been clear. They weren't giving up. They'd be back with legal pressure, or worse. Clara picked up Caleb, held him close until his crying subsided, and faced the truth she'd been avoiding. She couldn't fight this alone. Not if they brought lawyers and marshals and made this a legal battle. She needed help. Needed someone who understood how the system worked and could navigate it better than she could. The thought made her want to scream. She'd fought so hard to be independent, to prove she didn't need anyone. But pride wouldn't protect Caleb's inheritance. Smart strategy would. 2 days later, Clara made a decision that felt like betrayal, even though she knew it wasn't. She packed up Caleb, loaded a horse with her remaining trade goods, and rode back down to Stillwater. Mrs. Chen raised her eyebrows when Clara appeared again so soon. "Something wrong?" "I need a lawyer," Clara said flatly. "A good one. Who can I hire?" Mrs. Chen considered this. "There's Harrison Moss. He's honest, which is rare. Handles most of the property disputes around here. Office is above the bank." Clara found Harrison Moss exactly where Mrs. Chen said he'd be. A small, cluttered office that smelled like tobacco and old paper. Moss himself was in his 50s, balding, with eyes that looked like they'd seen every dirty trick in the book. He listened to Clara's story without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When she finished, he sat back and studied her. "The Montana Land Development Company," he said finally. "They're backed by railroad money. Big money. They want your land because there's talk of running a rail line through this territory, and your valley would make a perfect junction point." Clara's stomach sank. "Can they take it?" "They can try. Your claim is legal, but it's recent. They'll argue Pike's original claim was invalid, that he was squatting on public land. They might even find a judge who agrees with them, especially if they grease the right palms." "So I'm going to lose." "I didn't say that." Moss leaned forward. "They have money, but you have something better. A compelling story. War widow, infant child, husband who developed the land for 20 years. You play this right, make it public, and they'll have a hell of a time taking land from a woman and baby without looking like monsters." "I don't want publicity. I want them gone." "Then you need to make it too expensive and too embarrassing for them to pursue." Moss pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Here's what we do. We file a formal response to any claim they make, citing every legal precedent for homesteader rights. We document everything Pike built, proving the land was actively developed. We get statements from anyone who knew Pike, who can testify to his presence there. And we make sure every newspaper in the territory knows that a powerful company is trying to steal land from a widow." Clara felt a flicker of hope. "You think that'll work?" "I think it'll make them reconsider whether this fight is worth it." Moss met her eyes. "But I won't lie to you, Mrs. Pike. This could get ugly. They might escalate. And my services aren't cheap." "How much?" Moss named a figure that made Clara wince. It would take most of Pike's savings, leave her with almost nothing for emergencies. But what choice did she have? "All right," she said. "Do it." Over the next 3 months, Clara learned to hate the legal system with a passion that rivaled anything she'd felt before. There were papers to file, statements to give, endless meetings with Moss to go over strategy. She had to make multiple trips to Stillwater, leaving the homestead unattended for days at a time, always terrified she'd come back to find it burned down. But it wasn't burned. And slowly, painfully, Moss's strategy started working. He got statements from Jack Sutter and the other trappers who'd known Pike. He documented every improvement Pike had made to the land, every year of taxes paid, every bit of evidence that this was a legitimate claim. And he made sure the territorial newspapers knew exactly what was happening. The headlines started appearing in November. Land company threatens widow. Battle over mountain property heats up. Railroad interests versus pioneer rights. Public opinion, it turned out, mattered, especially when Clara showed up to one hearing with Caleb on her hip, looking every inch the struggling widow the newspapers had painted her as. Bingham's lawyers argued that Pike's claim had been invalid from the start, that the land belonged to the territory. Moss countered with 20 years of documented occupation, improvement, and tax payments. Back and forth, filing after filing, until even the judge looked exhausted. The turning point came in January, almost exactly a year after Pike's death. Clara was staying at Mrs. Chen's, preparing for yet another hearing, when Moss showed up at the boarding house looking oddly pleased. "They're withdrawing their claim," he said without preamble. Clara's heart stuttered. "What?" "Montana Land Development Company. They're officially withdrawing their challenge to your ownership." Moss actually smiled. "Turns out the territorial governor is up for re-election, and he doesn't want to be seen supporting a company that's trying to rob widows and orphans. He put pressure on them to drop it." Clara sat down hard on the nearest chair. "So it's over." "It's over. The land is yours, free and clear. They can't challenge the claim again without new evidence, which they won't find because it doesn't exist." She'd won. Against all odds, against money and power, and men who thought they could take whatever they wanted, Clara had won. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough. Moss waved it off. "You did the hard part. You survived long enough to fight. That's more than most people could manage." Clara left Stillwater 3 days later with legally certified papers that proved beyond any doubt that the Pike homestead belonged to her and Caleb. She also left with almost no money, most of Pike's savings gone to legal fees. But she had the land. That was what mattered. The ride back to the valley felt different this time. Final, somehow. Like she was closing the door on one life and fully stepping into another. When she crested the ridge and saw the cabin below, saw home, Clara felt something settle deep in her bones. This was where she belonged, where Caleb belonged. Not because circumstances had forced them here, but because they'd chosen it, fought for it, earned it. The winter of 1885 was hard, but Clara had learned what hard meant. She and Caleb survived on smoked meat and stored vegetables, on routines that kept them both alive and sane. Caleb was walking now, stumbling around the cabin on unsteady legs, getting into everything. Clara found herself talking to Pike more often, updating him on Caleb's progress like he was just in the next room. "He took 3 steps today without falling," she'd say to the empty cabin. "And he's got your temper when things don't go his way. Throws a fit like you wouldn't believe." Sometimes she swore she could hear Pike's voice responding, gruff and amused. But that was probably just exhaustion and grief playing tricks. Spring came, as it always did, and Clara threw herself into expanding the homestead. She added on to the garden, cleared more land, built a chicken coop from lumber Pike had stored in the barn. Small improvements, but each one made the place more sustainable, more permanent. Caleb helped in his own chaotic way, mostly by trying to eat dirt and getting underfoot. But Clara loved having him there, loved seeing him grow strong and curious in the mountain air. In May, she got a visitor, Jack Sutter, the trapper who'd warned her about filing the claim properly. "Heard you won your fight with the land company, what?" he said, accepting the coffee Clara offered. "Wanted to say congratulations. That took guts." "Took a good lawyer and a lot of luck," Clara corrected. "Took more than that." Jack glanced around the cabin, taking in the improvements, the signs of life. Pike would be proud. You've done right by his legacy. The words hit Clara harder than she'd expected. She had to turn away, pretend to check on Caleb before she could trust herself to speak. "I'm trying," she said finally. "You're succeeding." Jack set down his cup. "I'm heading north for the summer, but I wanted you to know, if you ever need help, you send word to Stillwater and I'll come. You're not as alone as you think." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. After Jack left, she stood on the porch with Caleb and looked out at the valley Pike had loved. She wasn't alone. She had Caleb, had this land, had people like Jack who'd proven they could be counted on. It wasn't the same as having Pike, but it was something. It was enough. The years that followed fell into a rhythm. Winters were hard, summers were work, and Caleb grew like a weed. By age 3, he could ride a horse, help feed the chickens, fetch water from the creek. Clara taught him everything Pike had taught her, passing down knowledge like it was the most valuable inheritance she could give. "Why do we check the trap lines even when we're not trapping?" Caleb asked one autumn morning when he was 4. "Because maintaining them is easier than rebuilding them," Clara answered, Pike's words coming out of her mouth. "And because your father spent years setting these lines. We honor that work by keeping it alive." "I don't remember my father." The statement was matter-of-fact, not sad, but it still made Clara's chest ache. "I know, but I do, and I'll make sure you know him through the things I teach you." Caleb seemed satisfied with this. He was a serious child, thoughtful beyond his years, with Pike's ability to sit still and observe before acting. But he also had moments of pure joy that reminded Clara that childhood should include happiness, not just survival. So she made time for play, for stories, for the small moments that made life worth living. She'd take Caleb to the high meadow, and they'd lie in the grass watching clouds, or down to the creek to catch frogs, or just sit by the fire while she told him stories about Pike, some true, some embellished, all designed to paint a picture of the father he'd never know. When Caleb turned 5, Clara started teaching him to read using the few books Pike had owned. It was slow going. She wasn't a trained teacher, but Caleb was smart and determined. By winter, he could read simple sentences, and Clara felt a fierce pride watching him puzzle out words by lamplight. "Why is reading important?" Caleb asked one evening. "We don't need it to trap or hunt." "Because there's more to life than surviving," Clara said. "Your father knew that. He built this place so you'd have choices, so you could be more than just another mountain man scraping by. Reading gives you those choices." "What if I want to be a mountain man like him?" Clara smiled. "Then you'll be a mountain man who can read, which makes you even better than he was." The homestead thrived. Clara's garden produced more than they needed, so she started trading the surplus. Her trapline skills improved until she could match Pike's old tallies. She bought more chickens, then a cow, slowly building up livestock. The cabin got new windows, a better stove, a floor that didn't creak. Money was still tight, but they were comfortable. More than comfortable. They were secure in a way Clara had never been in her life. When Caleb was 6, Clara caught him sitting at Pike's grave, talking to the wooden marker like she did. "What are you telling him?" she asked, settling beside her son. "That I caught a fish today. A big one." Caleb traced the carved letters of Pike's name. "Do you think he can hear me?" Clara considered this. She'd never been religious, never put much stock in afterlife stories, but standing at this grave, raising this child, she wanted to believe something remained. "I think the best parts of him are still here," she said finally. "In this land he built. In you. In the lessons I pass on. Maybe that's better than hearing. Maybe that's real immortality." Caleb thought about this, then nodded. "I'm going to make him proud." "You already do." By the time Caleb turned 10, he was doing a man's share of the work. He could check traplines solo, hunt small game, repair equipment, handle the horses with confidence. Clara watched him grow into someone capable and strong, and saw Pike in every movement. But she also saw herself, saw the way Caleb thought through problems instead of just reacting, the way he was kind to the animals even when efficiency would dictate otherwise, the way he asked questions instead of accepting things at face value. He was both of them, the best of both of them. One evening in late summer, when Caleb was 12, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Caleb had grown tall, already almost to Clara's shoulder, with Pike's broad frame starting to fill out. "Mama," he said. He still called her that, though he was getting to an age where boys usually stopped. "Why did you marry my father? I mean, I know the story, but really, why?" Clara considered how much truth to share. Caleb was old enough for honesty, she decided. "Because I had nothing and no future. And he offered me both," she said. "It was supposed to be a transaction. 1 year, a child, then I'd own this place and he'd have an heir. That was the deal." "But you loved him." "Yes. I didn't plan to, but I did." Clara looked at her son. "The thing about your father was that he saw me when no one else did. He believed I could be strong when I didn't believe it myself. That kind of faith changes a person." "Do you miss him?" "Every day. But I'm also grateful for the time we had." Clara put her arm around Caleb's shoulders. He gave me you, gave us this life. That's more than most people get. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars came out, brilliant and impossibly numerous. I'm going to keep this place, Caleb said eventually, when I'm grown. I'm not selling it or leaving. I'm going to build on what he started, what you've maintained, make it even better. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. He'd like that. I like that. And someday I'll have kids, and I'll teach them everything you taught me, the whole story, how Grandma Clara came to the mountains with nothing and built a legacy. Grandma Clara, Clara repeated, testing the words. I like the sound of that. The years continued to pass. Caleb grew into a young man, tall and capable, respected by the few trappers and traders who passed through. He never left the valley for long, always came back like the mountains were calling him home. Clara grew older too, silver threading through her hair, her hands more gnarled from work. But she was strong still, vital, refusing to slow down even when her body suggested she should. At 52, standing on the porch of the cabin Pike had built, watching Caleb work the trap lines with his own son, Rowan, named for the grandfather he'd never meet, Clara took stock of her life. She'd started with nothing, been dismissed and overlooked and told she'd never amount to anything. Then a dying man had offered her a desperate bargain, and she'd been brave enough or desperate enough to take it. Everything that came after, the love, the loss, the fighting, the surviving, the thriving, all of it had grown from that one moment of courage. Clara Pike owned 3,000 acres of prime Montana land, had raised a son who was raising his own son, had built something lasting from nothing but determination and refusal to quit. The woman she'd been in Stillwater, scared, small, invisible, was gone completely. In her place stood someone who'd carved out a life on her own terms, who'd fought off land developers and winter storms and grief that should have broken her. She'd won. Not just survived, but actually won. That evening, Clara walked up to Pike's grave. She did this less frequently now. The grief had dulled from a sharp blade to an old ache, but she still came when she had things to say. The wooden marker had weathered over the years, the carved letters fading. Clara traced them with her finger, remembering the man who'd saved her life by trusting her with his legacy. We did it, she said quietly. Everything you wanted. Caleb's strong, smart, good. He's teaching his own son now. The land's thriving. Your legacy's secure. A raven called from the trees, and Clara smiled. I kept my promises, all of them, and I built something even bigger than you imagined. So rest easy, Rowan Pike. Your gamble paid off. She stood there a moment longer, feeling the mountain wind on her face, then walked back down to the cabin where 3 generations of Pikes were waiting for dinner. The story could have ended in tragedy, the desperate seamstress who married a dying man and lost everything. But Clara had refused to let it end that way, had fought and clawed and survived until she'd transformed the ending into something else entirely. A triumph, a legacy, a life well lived on her own uncompromising terms. And as Clara watched the sun set over the mountains she'd learned to love, holding her grandson while her son stoked the fire, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd do it all again. Every hard choice, every painful loss, every moment of doubt and fear. Because this family, this land, this life built from nothing but will and courage, was worth any price. Clara Hayes had been nothing. Clara Pike was everything, and that made all the difference.